Have you ever made an perfectly logical, bulletproof plan only to just watch yourself make a completely irrational, emotion-driven decision in the heat of the moment?
Oh, all the time.
Like, you sit down on Sunday, you map out this strict budget, you swear you are going to cook every single meal at home this week, and then by Tuesday night, you're ordering premium sushi delivery just because you had a slightly stressful afternoon.
It is the ultimate human contradiction, isn't it? I mean, we are capable of doing complex orbital calculus and, sending rovers to Mars, yet we consistently sabotage our own stated goals for a momentary feeling.
Yeah, exactly.
We just love to think of ourselves as these perfectly rational calculating machines. But under the hood, there is a very different, deeply flawed operating system running the show.
And today, we are going to lift that hood. We are taking a deep dive into the hidden machinery of the human mind to understand why we make the choices we do and, more importantly, how to outsmart our own cognitive blind spots.
Which is incredibly important work.
To do this, we are pulling from a really deep well of research today. We are looking at Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman's foundational work on behavioral economics, practical playbooks on behavioral investing, and crucially, we are going to look at some modern, critical, meta-scientific reviews that are actively challenging some of psychology's most famous studies. Okay, let's unpack this.
It really is a vital discussion because today is about separating the robust, actionable science of decision-making from, well, the pop psychology myths that have sort of cluttered the internet for the last decade.
Right.
The goal here is to give you a genuine shortcut to making better choices in your daily life. And to do that, we have to start with the baseline of how your brain processes reality. Kahneman popularized this framework that our brains operate on two distinct modes of thought, which he categorized simply as System 1 and System 2.
Right, and for anyone who follows psychology, this is pretty familiar ground, but the biological reality of it is just wild to me. System 1 is fast, it's automatic, emotional, and totally unconscious.
Exactly, it's always running.
It's the system that lets you instantly complete the phrase bread and butter, or read a billboard while driving 60 miles an hour, or, instantly recoil when you smell spoiled milk. You don't deliberately choose to do these things. They just happen to you.
They do.
But then there is System 2. That's the slow, effortful, logical, and calculating part of the brain. It's what you have to engage when someone asks you to multiply 17 by 24.
And you can actually observe the physical toll of engaging System 2.
Wait, really? Like a physical change?
Oh, absolutely. When you try to do that math in your head, your pupils measurably dilate, your heart rate ticks up, your blood glucose levels actually drop.
Wow.
Yeah, it is metabolically expensive to think hard.
Which, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
I like to conceptualize it this way. It sounds like System 1 is the brain's autopilot, taking care of 95% of the flight without us even realizing it, while System 2 is the manual override that only kicks in during severe turbulence.
That's a really solid framing, though I'd argue it's even more aggressive than a standard autopilot.
How so?
Well, System 1 isn't just maintaining altitude. It is actively interpreting the world and making split-second bets to keep us alive. Evolutionarily speaking, it's the hero of the story.
Okay, right.
If you see a shadow move in the tall grouse, System 1 doesn't pause to logically deduce if the wind patterns match the movement of a tiger. It just floods your system with adrenaline and makes you jump back.
Better safe than sorry.
Exactly. The problem is, that exact reliance on quick mental shortcuts is what causes us to crash in modern, complex environments.
Because System 2, our manual override, is fundamentally lazy, right? Since it requires a massive amount of physical energy to run, the brain just defaults to System 1 whenever possible. We rely on these mental shortcuts, which psychologists call heuristics.
Precisely. Though the word shortcuts makes them sound like a conscious choice. Heuristics are automatic substitutions. They are highly efficient most of the time, but because they substitute a complex question for a simpler one, they systematically generate predictable errors in our judgment.
So let's look at the famous Linda problem, also known as the conjunction fallacy, because I think it illustrates this substitution perfectly.
Oh, this is a classic.
Right. So imagine a woman named Linda. She is young, outspoken, and deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice. As a student, she participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations.
Okay, got the picture.
Now, based on that exact description, which scenario is more likely? Option A, Linda is a bank teller. Or option B, Linda is a bank teller and an active feminist.
It's such a brilliant trap because when you ask people this, even like statistics graduate students, a huge percentage intuitively choose option B. It just feels right.
Logically, though, it's completely impossible for option B to be more likely.
Right. It violates the most basic Venn diagram of probability. Every single feminist bank teller is, by definition, a bank teller.
Exactly.
The category of bank tellers entirely encompasses the category of feminist bank tellers, so option A must be statistically more probable. But, you see, System 1 doesn't do probability.
No, it hates math.
When faced with the difficult computational question, which is statistically more probable, System 1 smoothly substitutes it with a much easier question. It asks, which description better matches my stereotype of Linda?
It completely bypasses the math. And this reliance on heuristics leads to other massive blind spots too, like the planning fallacy.
Oh, the planning fallacy is everywhere.
We have this pervasive optimistic bias when we project into the future. There was this fascinating data set looking at homeowners estimating the cost of their kitchen remodels. The homeowners confidently projected it would cost an average of $18,658.
And how did that work out?
The actual average cost when the dust settled, $38,769, more than double. We are just fundamentally terrible at factoring in the unknown unknowns.
And what's really fascinating here is how we cover our tracks after the fact with hindsight bias. Once that kitchen remodel goes over budget or a stock market crashes, we immediately weave this coherent narrative, making it seem like the event was entirely inevitable. We tell ourselves, I knew those contractors were going to find water damage, or I knew the tech bubble was going to burst.
Even though we had no idea at the time.
Exactly. We crave narrative coherence because a random, unpredictable universe is terrifying. But this is incredibly dangerous because it fools us into thinking we can actually predict the future, which leads to massive overconfidence.
Here's where it gets really interesting. These cognitive illusions don't just mess with our logic or our forecasting. They fundamentally warp how we value the physical world around us. And this brings us to prospect theory.
Right, the theory that revolutionized economics. Before Kahneman and his research partner Amos Tversky came along, classical economics relied on the idea of homo economicus.
The perfectly rational actor.
Yes, the completely rational actor making decisions solely to maximize their absolute wealth. But they proved that we don't actually care about absolute states. We care about changes from our current baseline. And crucially, we react to those changes asymmetrically.
Which is the concept of loss aversion.
Yes. The core tenet here is that losses loom far larger than gains. The psychological pain of losing $100 is empirically treated by our brains as if it were twice as intense as the joy of finding $100.
Wow, twice as intense.
Yeah, the emotional curve for a loss drops off a cliff compared to the gradual slope of a gain.
And the real-world evidence for this is just wild. Let's look at how it breaks classical economic theory, specifically the Coase theorem.
Oh, the mug experiment.
Yes. In a perfectly rational, frictionless market, goods should easily flow to whoever values them most, right? But researchers set up a market with university students. They randomly gave half the students ordinary coffee mugs. Then they opened up trading.
You'd expect a fluid market.
Exactly, but instead it just froze. The students who were given the mugs suddenly demanded a much higher price to sell them than the buyers were willing to pay. We instantly overvalue things the second we take ownership of them. It's called the endowment effect.
Because the physical object didn't change at all, only the psychological baseline changed. For the seller, giving up the mug is framed as a loss. For the buyer, acquiring it is framed as a gain.
And since losses hurt more.
Exactly. Because that loss hurts twice as much as the potential gain feels good, the sellers hoard the mugs, and the market breaks.
And it is so deeply wired into us that it transcends humans entirely. Evolutionary biologists ran this amazing study with capuchin monkeys.
I love this one.
They trained these monkeys to use little metal coins to buy apple slices. Then they introduced two different experimenters. Experimenter A would show the monkey one apple slice and then simply hand over one apple slice in exchange for the coin.
Simple enough.
But experimenter B would show the monkey two apple slices but then take one away and hand over the remaining one slice.
Mathematically, the net outcome is completely identical. One coin equals one apple slice.
But the monkeys wildly preferred experimenter A. They would actively avoid experimenter B because that interaction was framed as a loss. They saw two slices and felt the pain of losing one. Even monkeys are loss averse.
It's incredible.
We see the exact same thing in high-stakes human scenarios too, like education policy. Researchers in Chicago Heights wanted to see what kind of financial incentive would motivate teachers most to improve student test scores. One group got a traditional end-of-year bonus if scores went up, but the other group was given an $8,000 bonus up front at the beginning of the year.
With a catch, right?
With a huge catch. They had to pay it back if test scores didn't rise.
It leverages the exact same psychological machinery as the monkeys. The fear of losing the $8,000 that is already sitting in their bank account is a vastly more powerful motivator than the hope of gaining $8,000 in the future.
Okay, so I want to play devil's advocate here and push back a little bit.
Go for it.
This all sounds like a perfectly packaged, elegant theory of the human mind. The fast and slow systems, the loss aversion, the monkeys. I mean, it makes intuitive sense. But if there's one thing we are learning today, it's that we shouldn't blindly trust a good narrative.
Very true.
Looking at the meta-scientific reviews in our research, there are some massive red flags waving over this era of behavioral psychology. A lot of these famous studies are kind of falling apart under modern scrutiny.
It is a crucial point, and your skepticism is exactly what System 2 is for. We really have to talk about the replication crisis. In the years since this research entered the mainstream, the field of psychology has undergone a pretty brutal reckoning.
Yeah, it has.
Independent labs have tried to rerun these classic experiments, and a shocking number of them simply fail to produce the same results.
Yeah, the data analyzing these older studies is harsh. They use something called the R-index, or replicability index, which calculates the statistical power of a study versus how often it actually finds a true positive. Some of the most famous concepts in behavioral science literally get a failing grade.
Right, like implicit priming.
Exactly. The chapter in Kahneman's own book on implicit priming, which is the idea that subtle, unconscious cues in our environment completely alter our complex behaviors, it scored an abysmal R-index of 14. That means there's less than a 50% chance those results would replicate in a rigorous, modern environment.
Implicit priming was built on this idea of a hypersensitive System 1 that could be easily manipulated by researchers, but we now know the statistical foundations of those original studies were incredibly shaky.
How so?
Well, they often used very small sample sizes, which creates noisy data. But more importantly, the field suffered from massive publication bias and p-hacking. Researchers would run the data dozens of different ways until they found a statistically significant anomaly, publish that one finding, and just shove all the failed experiments into a file drawer.
Oh, wow. It reminds me of that famous urban legend about the movie theater owner who supposedly flashed a picture of a Coke bottle on the screen for a fraction of a second, and suddenly everybody rushed to the concession stand.
Which turned out to be a complete fabrication by a market researcher. But the academic studies of the 2000s weren't much better, they were just dressed up in scientific jargon. To his immense credit, Daniel Kahneman himself later publicly admitted that he placed way too much faith in those underpowered social psychology studies because they fit so neatly into his broader theory.
Which is the ultimate irony. A Nobel laureate who dedicated his life to studying cognitive biases fell victim to System 1 fast thinking. He trusted a statistically flawed narrative because it felt coherent.
It proves his own point perfectly. No one is immune. And the scientific process is slowly correcting itself. For example, some modern researchers are even pushing back on loss aversion itself. Yekhaim and Hochman proposed a really compelling alternative theory called loss attention.
Oh, interesting. How does that shift the paradigm?
Well, loss aversion assumes that losses inherently possess a higher negative utility, meaning they genuinely hurt more. Loss attention proposes that losses don't necessarily hurt more, rather they cause a massive spike in our autonomic nervous system.
Like a physical reaction.
Exactly. Your pupils dilate, your heart rate jumps. This physical arousal simply forces you to pay more attention to the task at hand.
Oh, this connects perfectly to the Yerkes-Dodson law in psychology. That's the inverse U-curve, showing that you need just the right amount of stress to perform well. Too little stress and you're bored and make sloppy mistakes. Too much and you panic. Loss attention seems to provide that perfect little spike of stress to wake up the brain.
Precisely. Under loss attention, the prospect of a loss acts as an alerting mechanism. In some monotonous laboratory tasks, introducing a small financial penalty actually improves the subject's performance because it forces their lazy System 2 to wake up and focus.
Wow.
This completely contradicts the rigid idea that humans universally avoid all losses. This raises an important question. How much of what we know about behavioral economics is an absolute hardwired truth versus a highly context-dependent reaction?
So if the science is messy, and some of these specific priming studies don't replicate, do we just throw out the whole concept of System 1 and System 2? Is the whole framework just broken?
Emphatically, no. While a study about holding a warm cup of coffee making you feel warmly toward a stranger might be bunk, The overarching architecture of our cognitive vulnerabilities remains immensely powerful.
Okay, good to know.
Our brains do want to take the easy way out, and nowhere is that vulnerability more consistently weaponized against us than when money is on the line, which is why these concepts are still the bedrock of behavioral investing.
Right, because if you look at practical guides from financial institutions, they don't care about lab experiments, they care about surviving a market crash. We know System 1 is going to panic when your portfolio drops 10% or feel immense FOMO, fear of missing out when a hot new tech stock spikes. So how do we build a firewall against our own biology?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the goal of any good strategy is to intentionally force System 2 to engage when System 1 is screaming to take the wheel. It's about introducing calculated friction.
Friction, I like that.
One of the most effective strategies utilized by professional investors is using strict, pre-written checklists and keeping an investing journal.
Because the physical act of writing forces you to slow down.
Yeah.
If you have to articulate and document exactly why you are buying an asset, you interrupt that emotional System 1 impulse. You can't just write down, because my neighbor's getting rich off it.
Exactly. It shifts the cognitive load. Another powerful tool for battling our optimistic bias is the pre-mortem. Before you finalize a major decision, whether it's buying a house, starting a business, or making an investment, you imagine it is 1 year in the future. The decision was an absolute, unmitigated disaster.
Okay, grim.
Right. But your task is to work backward and explain exactly why it failed.
I love that mechanism. It forces you to actively hunt for the unknown unknowns that the planning fallacy usually hides from us. You're giving your brain permission to look for flaws instead of just seeking confirming evidence. And another strategy to combat that inside bias is relying on base rates.
Yes, understanding the distinction between the inside view and the outside view. The inside view is your specific, highly detailed situation. System 1 loves the inside view because it's emotional. The outside view, or the base rate, is the objective historical data of a broad category of similar situations. If you are opening a restaurant, your inside view says your grandmother's recipes are amazing, your location is perfect, and you will succeed.
But the reality is,
The base rate tells you that 60% of independent restaurants fail in the first year. Engaging System 2 means forcing yourself to anchor your financial expectations to that cold, hard base rate, not your warm inside view.
it's all about creating friction,
Yeah.
making it harder to make a fast decision. But as we reach the final layer of this analysis, we arrive at a truly philosophical peak, because ultimately the most important choices we make aren't about stock portfolios or kitchen remodels. They're about how we evaluate our own lives and our own happiness.
Right.
And this introduces Kahneman's profound concept of the two selves.
This might be the most enduring insight from his body of work. He distinguishes between the experiencing self and the remembering self.
Okay, tell me more.
The experiencing self lives entirely in the present moment, constantly answering the question, how does it feel right now? But the remembering self is the historian. It looks back and answers the question, how was it on the whole? And the shocking finding is that these two selves process reality in completely different ways.
The mechanism here is called duration neglect, which leads to the peak end rule. Imagine you go on a beautiful all-day picnic. The weather is perfect, the food is great, you laugh with your friends for 6 solid hours.
Sounds idyllic.
But on the drive home, you get a flat tire and have to change it in the pouring rain. Your experiencing self had 6 hours of pure joy and maybe 45 minutes of misery. But your remembering self, it will categorize that entire day as a disaster. It completely ignores the vast duration of the pleasure.
Because the remembering self doesn't tally up hours like a ledger, memory encoding is highly selective. It over-indexes on only 2 specific data points: the absolute peak intensity of the emotional experience and how the experience ultimately ended. Everything else fades away.
And it applies to massive life events, too. Think of a 20-year marriage that ends in a tense, bitter divorce. The remembering self will often look back and label the entire 20 years as a failure, completely erasing a decade of genuine, daily joy, solely because the end was painful.
It forces you to ask a really difficult, fundamental question. Which self are you actually making decisions for? When you plan a vacation, are you planning it for the experiencing self to actually relax in the moment? Or are you packing the itinerary to create a highlight reel for the remembering self to consume later?
That's tough.
A true concept of well-being has to account for both, how you feel in the fleeting present and how you evaluate your life in retrospect.
So what does this all mean? We've covered incredible ground today. We've learned that your brain is running a highly efficient but deeply flawed autopilot system. We're biologically wired to feel the pain of a loss far more than the joy of a gain. We create neat narratives out of random chaos to feel a sense of control.
We do.
And even though some of the specific academic studies from the past have been challenged by modern science, the overarching reality remains. We are susceptible to our own shortcuts. But by slowing down, utilizing checklists, searching for objective base rates, and forcing System 2 to do the heavy lifting, we can make vastly better choices.
And, crucially, we can learn to forgive ourselves a bit too. Recognizing that these biases aren't personal failures but fundamentally human traits is the first step toward mitigating them.
I want to leave you with a final, lingering thought to explore on your own. It builds on this idea of the two selves and the peak end rule. If our remembering self only really cares about the absolute peak of an experience and how it ends, couldn't you artificially hack your own
Oh,
happiness?
that's an interesting idea.
Right. If you have to endure a miserable week-long project at work, what if you purposely planned an incredibly fun, high-intensity reward for the final 5 minutes of that week? Could you exploit your own duration neglect and trick your brain into remembering a terrible week as a genuinely great experience? Next time you have to do something you absolutely hate, try engineering your own ending and see which of your two selves wins. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious.